Hey guys, it's Soda here, welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be talking about what I think are 5 of the most common problems you can have in your aquarium and how you can fix them. So I decided to make this video because I do get quite a lot of comments or DMs asking me how they can fix a problem with their aquarium, whether it's algae or snails or fish are dying, they don't know what to do. So I thought I would just make a whole video talking about some of that, and hopefully I can answer your questions and help you with those problems. Fish keeping is not always an easy fun hobby. Sometimes you can get some issues, and I feel like at some point every fish keeper has to deal with some kind of problem in their fish tank, whether it's like a disease or algae or whatever. I do understand that there can be a lot of conflicting information on how to deal with these problems, so I'm just kind of talking about what has helped for me with experiencing some of these problems and what I've learned from my research. If you do have any questions or need some help with your aquarium, feel free to comment it down below. But watch this video first because this video might answer your questions. So for number 1, I'm going to talk about algae, because algae is something that everyone deals with as a fish keeper, and I feel like a lot of people don't really realize that algae isn't actually a bad thing. It just kind of looks bad. And I understand that. I don't like the look of algae either, but it's still something that I deal with and that pretty much everyone deals with, but there is still ways of getting rid of it. Algae can actually be beneficial just like plants are in your aquarium, but again, it doesn't look as nice. Now when you do start a new tank, it is very normal to get some of that brown algae. This is the kind of algae that will probably just go away with time. It's kind of just something that you'll get with a new tank. If you're just starting with a fish tank and you're still cycling it and stuff, you'll probably end up getting this brown algae in there. And honestly, it's really nothing to worry about. This algae is very easy to get rid of. You can literally just wipe it off with your hand or just use a toothbrush, and it's very likely this algae will just stop within a few weeks. Once your tank is more cycled and more developed, this algae usually will just go away, so it's just kind of a time thing with this one. You just gotta be a bit patient. I mean, you still should wipe it off when you see it, but this one will likely just go away with its own time. The reason that we do get algae in our tanks is because it basically is caused by an imbalance of lighting and nutrients, which you kind of will always have in an aquarium, especially if you don't have plants. If you don't have any live plants in your tank, you pretty much will always have an imbalance of nutrients, which will cause algae in your tank. So having live plants will help a lot with that. Basically, instead of the algae taking all the nutrients and the lighting in the tank, the plants will take that instead and it will help the plants grow. You still might get some algae, but the plants will definitely help with that. And plants really aren't as hard to care for as you may think. A lot of people seem to be a bit scared getting into plants with aquariums, but there's a lot of really easy plants you can get. Most of the plants I have are just really easy ones that I don't really need to do anything for. I just kind of let them do their thing and they are happy like that. But I definitely feel like that if you don't have any plants in your tank, it's going to be very hard for you to get rid of algae in your tank. Having too much light coming into your aquarium is usually one of the biggest reasons for getting so much algae. If your tank is by a window and there's getting a lot of sunlight in there, it's gonna get a lot of algae, which is why usually you shouldn't have your tank by a window. So if you're getting a lot of like green algae or your water's turning green and stuff like that, usually it can be a lighting issue. I recommend keeping your fish tank lights on for about 8 to 10 hours a day. I think mine are on for about 8 hours a day, sometimes a little bit less, sometimes a little bit more. I don't have a timer on, so I just kind of turn them on. So if you say your lights are on for 10 hours a day, try reducing it by a couple of hours and see if that makes a difference. Now this tank behind me is actually right in front of a window. There's just a curtain covering it at this moment, and I actually have no problems with it being there. It doesn't get overheated or anything, but also I don't get a lot of sun coming through this window, and usually I have the tank covered. I have like a cardboard thing that I cover it with, but sometimes I get bored of it and I just take it off for a while because it looks a lot nicer without the cardboard thing in the background. I do get algae in that tank, but it's really minor. I can just scrub it off whenever I'm doing my weekly water changes. So yeah, I think it's like still possible to have a tank this close to a window. You just have to be aware of those problems and make sure that mainly make sure it doesn't overheat or anything like that. It's the biggest thing. And some other options, you can get some algae eating fish or snails or shrimp to help with that. Just be aware that you shouldn't rely on them cleaning all the algae in your tank. Really, they will only make a small difference, especially if we're talking about snails and shrimp. Shrimp will do a very minor difference that you probably won't even notice, but they still could help if you have like a million of them. And snails, Honestly, I've never seen much of a difference with snails. Now, we can't get a lot of snail types here. We can only get like a few different types of snails. But I do have mystery snails, and I've never really found them to do much of a difference with algae. But it's nice to have them anyway, and they probably do make a small difference that I just don't notice. But snails are nice to have in your aquarium anyway. They will help a bit with that algae. Stay away from apple snails. Those guys will demolish all of your plants, but most other snails will only eat decaying plants. On more extreme cases, you can go for an algae-eating fish, like a Siamese algae eater. Now, I always kind of don't suggest this option because you do have to have the right size tank to actually get that fish, and Siamese algae eaters and like ottos and stuff need to be kept in schools, so you have to get more than just one if you want them to be happy. So you have to have the right size tank for that, and like algae eaters can get a bit big, so it's so loud. Oh my god, my ears. But having like a Siamese algae eater would definitely be helpful for the more like extreme algae, like blackbeard algae. That stuff is a pain in the ass. I know from experience. I have had problems with blackbeard algae. And you know, if you do have the appropriate size tank to add a Siamese algae eater to fix that, then sure, that will probably be the best option. Some people will like rent a Siamese algae eater from someone and then give it back to them after. And if you get to the point where nothing else is working, you can always just get a product to help with some algae. Finally resorted to using a algae product fairly recently to get rid of my blackbeard algae because nothing else seemed to be working, and blackbeard algae, like, it just spreads and it's really hard to get rid of. You can scrape it all off, and if there's like one little bit left that you missed, it will still grow. So I recently brought this. This is from the 24-Hour Aquarius. It's called APT Fix Algae Treatment, and it treats blackbeard algae. And this actually helped very, very well. You actually use a pipette to put it directly onto the affected areas in your tank, and it works so well. I've always been a bit wary of algae products because some products like Algae Fix from Aqua One have like really bad reviews, and some people have said that their fish have actually died from it even if they haven't overdosed on the product, and it can be harmful to like snails and scaleless fish and stuff like that. So I've always been a bit scared to use a product to help with algae, but this stuff seems to be really good. I've had no problems with it. It's helped with my tank a lot, so I'd recommend that if you get to the point where nothing else is working. But at the end of the day, if you like the look of algae, you can just leave it there. It won't hurt your fish or anything, so it really comes down to your personal choice, really. So for number 2 is a cloudy fish tank. This again is something that's very common with new fish tanks. When you're first starting a fish tank and you're just starting to cycle it, you can get something called bacteria bloom, which makes your tank look quite cloudy for a bit, and usually you just wait this off and it will go away. Those two are arguing in the background. Sometimes a cloudy tank and a bacteria bloom is just part of the cycle process for a new tank, new sand or gravel or whatever. It can also make a tank cloudy. Even if you wash it, sometimes it still can be really cloudy for a bit. That'll eventually go away as well. But if your new tank is still cloudy after like a couple of weeks, then it could be something else. Probably the main thing would be having a filter that's not powerful enough for your tank. Like your filter is too small, doesn't have a very powerful flow. So make sure the filter you're using is actually the appropriate size to use in your tank. And maybe even use like an extra filter. Like in my big tank here, I use 2 filters. I have a sponge filter and a regular internal filter. It also could be due to overfeeding your tank. If you're cycling a tank and you're using food to help create ammonia and cycle your fish tank, it really shouldn't cause the tank to go cloudy unless you're using like way too much food. So if it is causing that and there's like a lot of rotting food floating around, maybe reduce the food a bit. Make sure you're cleaning that out when you're doing your water changes, you know. If your tank's already well established and it's always getting cloudy and stuff, then you're probably overfeeding your fish, which I think is a really big problem that a lot of people do. So make sure that you're not doing that, because that's a really important thing, and overfeeding can cause a lot of issues and illnesses in your fish and a lot of issues with your water quality. So be wary of that. You should really only be feeding your fish as much food as they can consume within a few minutes. So if you just fed them and a few minutes later there's still heaps of food around, then you're definitely feeding them way too much food. That can cause other issues too, which I'll talk about later on. The next issue is obviously fish dying. If your fish are just dying one by one and you don't know why, I think the most important thing you should do before anything else is test your water. Most fish keepers do have a master test kit on hand, but if you don't, a lot of pet stores will test your water for you. But most of the time, if all your fish are dying and there's something wrong with your water quality, something is off, maybe your cycle crashed and you didn't realize, something like that. So test your water first, and see if parameters are a problem here. If your parameters are off, it can cause stress, which can cause your fish to get sick easy and die, as well as if you have a high ammonia in your tank that can kill your fish. Also, you should always be using a dechlorinator in your fish tank. Prime dechlorinator is the best one I would recommend. I use it for all my fish tanks and it's very good. It'll last you a long time as well, even if you have a lot of fish tanks like I do. Water from your tap has chlorine in it, which can kill your fish and also kill all your beneficial bacteria in your fish tank. That's also why whenever you're cleaning your fish tank filter every few months or whatever, you should only be using old water from your fish tank to clean your filter and not tap water, or you could crash your cycle. Another thing is that if you're buying fish and they're dying very quickly after you brought them, I would recommend that you don't buy fish from chain pet stores, especially American chain pet stores. I would highly recommend that you get your fish from your local like fish store instead of a chain pet store. Chain pet stores don't really take the best care of their fish. A lot of the time the fish you buy will already be sick, they'll already be very stressed, so they will easily get sick. They are housed in overcrowded tanks. The pet store employees often give a lot of misinformation about fish, and also a lot of chain pet stores don't actually quarantine their fish too, so as soon as they get them, they put them straight into the tanks where people can buy them from, and they could very easily be sick. A lot of proper fish specialist stores do actually quarantine their fish before putting them out for sale, so it's a lot less likely that you'll buy a fish that's already sick. Also, fish from chain pet stores are often really poorly bred, especially fish that are like guppies and stuff like that. They probably won't live very long because they're just so inbred at this point. A lot of time you go to a pet store, a lot of the guppies are like deformed, they have bad spines. That's just a good sign that they've been poorly bred and you shouldn't support that. So if you already have a well-established tank and you want to add fish to that tank, it's also a good idea to quarantine your fish before you actually put them in that tank. So maybe have an extra little fish tank on the side where you can quarantine new fish for a month before adding them to your tank, just to make sure they're not introducing any bad diseases into your already well-established tank. Now the small things, make sure you don't add the water from the pet store into your fish tank. You don't want to ruin your well-established tank with pet store water, and you should always acclimate your fish before putting them in the water as well. You don't want to put them into shock by putting them into new water. There's a few different ways you can do that. You can just do the simple method of floating their bag on the tank water for like 30 minutes, or if they're a more sensitive fish, you can do the longer acclimation, like a drip acclimation to them. I feel like those are a bit more well known, but some people still don't do that, so yeah, make sure that you acclimate and don't put the water from the fish store in your tank. Dying fish kind of is in the similar category as fish getting sick and getting diseases. Diseases is something everyone usually will experience in their fish keeping time. One of the most common ones is white spot. I feel like everyone deals with that at some point. Thankfully, white spot is very easy to fix, so usually once you notice it with your fish, get some medication real quick, they should all be fine. But if you don't take action, then you can lose your fish. It's very easy to identify just little white spots on your fish. It spreads super quickly to your other fish, so treat the whole tank. There's so many different white spot medications you can get out there. It's very easy to find medication for white spot, so you'll have no trouble with that. You can also raise your tank temperature a little bit. Make sure you do that slowly though, you don't want to put your fish into shock. There's actually quite a lot of parasites that fish can get, so being able to identify those is quite important, but thankfully most of those are pretty easy to fix. Fungal infections are also very common with your fish. Very easy to identify. Your fish might have some white fuzzy patches on them, but a fungal problem most likely means there's something wrong with your water. Again, fungal infections pretty easy to cure with some fungal medication, but it's also very easy to avoid if you just have good tank water. Another thing that's very helpful to always have on hand is Indian almond leaf. This is a leaf that has natural healing properties, and it's very helpful to have if you have sick fish. Put some in your tank and it will help them a lot. But like I said, there's a lot of different kinds of parasites and illnesses that your fish can get, so really it's up to you to do more research on that, because I feel like I can't talk about everything in this video. I don't want it to be like an hour long. Do some googling about their symptoms and find what the problem could be. And last we have snail infestations. This is something I've been asked about before, like why there's so many snails in my tank, why are they taking over, how do I get rid of them? I see a lot of people always ask about this in like fish groups all the time. So it's very common. Sometimes you might buy some live plants from a pet store and there might be some little stowaways on them and you might not notice them even if you wash the plants before putting them in the tank. Sometimes they hang on pretty well. Or even there's sometimes eggs attached and you can't even see them because they're hidden under a leaf or something. And then you end up with a bunch of snails in your tank. Honestly, I think the reason that they go so crazy in a lot of people's tanks is because they're overfeeding their tanks. I've never had a problem with snails in any of my tanks, and I've had pest snails in my tanks before, like several times, but they've never got extreme for me. I think it's just because I don't overfeed my tanks, so they just don't breed. I think I still have some like pest snails in some of my tanks, but there's only like some little ones I see every now and then they just disappear or whatever. I think it's just because I don't overfeed my tanks, and the people that do have these problems with snails taking over is because they feed way too much food in their tank. And if you cut down your feeding a lot, they just kind of die off and stop breeding. So that's really the best thing that will help, like, because the only reason they're there is because they have constant food source. So I think the best thing you can do is cut down on your feeding, and that should really solve the problem. You can get snail traps or like snail killer and stuff like that, but honestly it's really not that hard to just cut down on your feeding a bit, and that will solve the problem. Having a couple of like pest snails in your tank won't hurt. They're really harmless. Honestly, they will help your tank as well. So don't worry if you have a couple in your tank. You can just pick them out if you really don't want them, but they won't cause any harm, and they really shouldn't overbreed unless you're overfeeding. Okay, my throat hurts from talking so much, but that is what I believe to be some of the most common aquarium problems, and I hope I could help you with them. If anyone else has anything they'd like to add that I might have missed, feel free to do so in the comments below. If you have any questions, feel free to comment. Google is also a good option. Maybe I'll do more of these in the future because I'm sure there's a lot more things that I could talk about in this video, but I'm gonna end it here. So thank you for watching, guys. Let me know what else you'd like to see on my channel. Also, I have a P.O Box right now, so if you want me to open fan mail video, feel free to send it to my P.O Box. I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!